He had felt the sting of judgment before, but never this openly, never this boldly. The flight attendant's sneer, the deliberate way she ignored him, the disgust in her eyes, as if serving him was beneath her. It wasn't just discrimination. It was humiliation. Whispers from other passengers, averted gazes, the suffocating weight of being treated as less than human. And as he sat there, swallowing the anger burning in his chest, he had no idea that soon the very woman who had tried to strip him of his dignity would be the one begging for his mercy. Watch until the end to see how this incredible story unfolds, and let us know what time you're watching today. Orem Airlines Flight 417 was preparing for departure, the terminal's fluorescent lights casting a dull glow over the passengers boarding with weary movements. The air held a manufactured chill, the kind meant to keep tempers low and comfort high, but there was something else lingering, something unspoken, an energy crackling beneath the surface. Elena Carter adjusted the cuffs of her crisp navy blue uniform, her fingers lingering over the golden pins on her lapel. She prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to glide through tense situations with a polished smile and an unwavering demeanor. Tonight would be no different. It was just another flight, another few hours spent serving passengers who barely glanced up from their phones or newspapers. Her heels clicked against the jet bridge as she stepped onto the aircraft, inhaling the familiar sterile scent of recycled air and faint traces of cologne left behind by businessmen rushing to their seats. The first-class cabin was already half full, a mix of travelers settling into plush leather seats. She offered a practiced smile, scanning the section for anything out of place. A man in seat 2A caught her eye, not for any particular reason at first, just another passenger. He was well-dressed, his suit sharp, his posture composed, yet there was something about him that made her hesitate for the briefest second. His presence had weight, an unspoken authority, though he didn't seem to be seeking attention. He was just sitting there, watching the world with quiet observation. Elena quickly turned her attention elsewhere. The rest of the crew was moving through the aisles, assisting passengers, stowing bags. Everything was routine. She liked routine. Routine kept things predictable, manageable. Yet, predictability had a way of unraveling when least expected. It started subtly. A delay. A technical glitch with the boarding system that caused murmurs of impatience. Nothing unusual, but enough to shift the energy in the cabin. People hated waiting. Frustration, no matter how minor, was contagious. Elena moved to the galley, checking the pre-flight preparations, when she overheard a quiet conversation between two of her colleagues. "Did you see him?" one whispered. "The guy in 2A. Yeah, something about him seems, I don't know, familiar." Elena arched a brow but said nothing. It wasn't uncommon for crew members to speculate about high-profile passengers, celebrities, CEOs, politicians, people who carried themselves differently. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a revised departure time. More murmurs, more shifting in seats. Elena forced another smile and stepped back into the aisle. She barely noticed the moment when her eyes met his again. The man in 2A. There was something about the way he watched people, not impatiently, not rudely, but with a quiet awareness. It unsettled her, though she couldn't explain why. Shaking it off, she continued down the aisle, stopping when an elderly woman signaled for assistance. Routine. Manageable. The flight would take off soon, and all of this, the static tension, the subtle disturbances, would fade into the hum of engines and predictable service schedules. Or so she thought. Elena smoothed down the front of her uniform and exhaled softly, reminding herself that professionalism was her armor. It had to be. A job like this demanded composure, even when something in the air felt off. She moved with fluid efficiency, offering rehearsed smiles as she made her way through the cabin, checking on passengers. Some barely acknowledged her, others gave the obligatory nod or polite smile. It was a usual assortment. Businessmen immersed in emails, an elderly couple whispering to each other in a language she didn't recognize, a nervous first-time flyer gripping the armrests too tightly. Yet her attention kept snagging on 2A. The man sat with his legs crossed, one hand resting on the armrest, the other lightly gripping the stem of a half-empty glass of water. He exuded a kind of quiet confidence, the kind that didn't demand space, but naturally commanded it. His gaze flickered toward her briefly, a mere glance, yet it sent a jolt through her. Not because it was intrusive. Quite the opposite. It was unreadable, calculated. She swallowed down the unease that pressed against her ribs and continued with her duties. The intercom crackled again, this time with an announcement from the captain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We are awaiting final clearance from ground control and expect to be in the air shortly. Thank you for your patience." A low wave of discontent rippled through the passengers. Barely audible groans, the shifting of bodies, the frustrated tapping of fingers against tray tables. Elena had been working flights long enough to know that delays could make even the most seasoned travelers irritable. She approached a row where a middle-aged man in a pinstriped suit was sighing dramatically, making a show of glancing at his watch. "Sir, would you care for something to drink while we wait?" she offered, her voice smooth and professional. "I'd care to take off," the man muttered, but he still accepted the glass of whiskey she poured for him. As she moved back toward the galley, she caught a glimpse of 2A again. He hadn't moved, hadn't complained, just sat there, observing. She didn't know why it irked her. Maybe because she'd worked long enough in this job to categorize people quickly. She could spot the anxious travelers, the impatient ones, the entitled ones who barely saw flight attendants as people. But 2A didn't fit neatly into any of those categories. As she reached the galley, she found her co-worker, Jess, already there, leaning against the counter with an arched brow. "You're distracted," Jess noted, her voice teasing. "Something got under your skin." Elena scoffed. "Nothing I can't handle." Jess smirked, glancing past her. "If you say so." Elena followed her gaze, right to 2A. She rolled her eyes and shook her head. "Stop." "I didn't say anything," Jess said, but her expression was all mischief. Before Elena could respond, a chime from the cockpit signaled that they had finally been given the green light for takeoff. The plane pushed back from the gate, the familiar hum of the engines growing as it taxied down the runway. Elena moved quickly, securing the galley, double-checking that everything was in place. As the aircraft lifted into the air, she felt the faint pull of gravity, the familiar pressure in her chest that came with ascent. It was a feeling she never tired of, that brief moment where the world below seemed to fall away. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and with it, the first round of service began. Elena slipped back into her routine, cart in tow, moving down the aisle with effortless efficiency. First-class passengers were served first, of course. Hot towels, drink orders, small pleasantries exchanged with the kind of rehearsed warmth she had perfected over years in the sky. When she reached 2A, she felt her breath hitch for a fraction of a second. He was watching her again, not in an inappropriate way, not with impatience or arrogance, just watching. She steadied her voice. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" For a moment, he didn't respond, as if turning the question over in his mind. Then he set his glass down lightly on the tray table. "Just water," he said. His voice was deep, smooth, and deliberate. She nodded, filling a fresh glass and setting it before him. "Thank you," he added. She blinked. Passengers rarely thanked flight attendants like they meant it, but his voice carried weight, like gratitude wasn't just a reflex, but an intentional choice. She didn't know how to respond to that. So, she simply nodded and moved on. Minutes passed, then an hour. The cabin settled into quiet. Passengers dozing off, movies playing on seat screens, the occasional clink of ice shifting in glasses. Elena leaned against the galley counter, exhaling slowly. It was the calm before the storm. Long flights always had their moments. Unexpected turbulence, a passenger getting too drunk, a minor medical emergency. It was only a matter of time. And then, "Excuse me." A sharp voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. Elena turned to see a woman from first class standing in the aisle, arms crossed tightly. "I asked for a glass of wine 10 minutes ago," the woman snapped. As she turned to pour the drink, she caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. 2A had shifted, his gaze flicking toward the woman with an unreadable expression. He was listening. Elena delivered the wine with a neutral expression, then retreated back to the galley, her heart still thrumming with irritation. It never failed. Some passengers saw them as nothing more than servants, forgetting they were human too. As she turned to grab a bottle of water for herself, a deep voice stopped her. "Elena, is it?" She froze. Slowly, she turned to find 2A standing near the galley, his eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. She hadn't told him her name. Her throat went dry. "Excuse me." He smiled, just barely. It wasn't smug, just knowing. "Elena Carter," he said, like he was testing the weight of her name. "I wanted to properly introduce myself." A pause. Then, "My name is Marcus Reynolds." Something in her stomach lurched. The name carried weight, significance, but her brain couldn't place it immediately. She felt Jess shift beside her, suddenly stiff. Elena's mind raced, scanning her memory, searching for where she had heard that name before. Then it hit her. Marcus Reynolds, the newly appointed senior executive of Orem Airlines. Her new boss. A cold wave of realization crashed over her. And the way he was looking at her now, it told her he knew exactly who she was too. The moment hung heavy between them, like the silent anticipation before a storm. Elena forced herself to maintain eye contact, though every instinct told her to look away, to pretend she hadn't just been caught completely off guard. Marcus Reynolds, her new boss. The realization struck with an almost physical force, and yet, standing there in the dimly lit galley, nothing about the situation felt real. She had spent the entire flight subtly trying to categorize him, and now, the truth unraveled all of her assumptions in a single breath. He knew exactly who she was, and yet, he had waited until now to say something. "Elena," Marcus repeated, his voice calm measured. He studied her like he was waiting for a reaction, gauging the shift in her posture, the flicker in her expression. Jess shifted beside her, her usually sharp eyes darting between them, sensing the sudden tension. Elena swallowed, forcing herself to straighten. "Mr. Reynolds," she said finally, her tone professional, her grip tightening on the edge of the counter. I didn't realize." He raised a hand slightly, stopping her mid-sentence. No need for formalities. His lips curled, but it wasn't quite a smile. "I didn't want to make a scene earlier." A scene. The weight of his words sank into her like an anchor. He had been watching, observing, and now, she had no idea what he had seen, what conclusions he had already drawn. She cast a glance at Jess, who, for once, seemed at a loss for words. Elena exhaled slowly, trying to regain control of the situation. "What brings you on this flight?" she asked, careful to keep her voice neutral. "Business," he answered smoothly. "This airline is my priority right now. I'm here to get a sense of how things operate, firsthand." The implication was clear. He wasn't just a passenger. He was assessing, analyzing. Elena had spent years perfecting the art of blending into the background, of being noticed only when necessary. Now, she was under a microscope. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You seem surprised." "I just wasn't expecting," she hesitated. "You." Most people don't. There was something layered in that response, but before she could unpack it, a voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are currently cruising at 36,000 feet. Expect some mild turbulence as we pass through a weather front, but we'll keep you updated as needed." Almost on cue, a slight tremor rippled through the plane, a reminder of just how fragile control could be. Elena gripped the counter instinctively. Marcus, however, barely moved. His gaze never left hers, and something about his unwavering attention made her uneasy. She cleared her throat. "If there's anything you need, Mr. Reynolds, please don't hesitate to ask." For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, with a slow nod, he said, "I appreciate that, Elena." She turned quickly, needing space, needing to breathe. Jess followed close behind as they retreated down the aisle, back to the relative safety of their usual routine. The moment they were out of earshot, Jess exhaled sharply. Holy! She ran a hand through her blonde curls. Are you kidding me? That's our new boss. Elena didn't respond. She was too busy replaying every interaction she had with him since he boarded, analyzing every moment, every word. Jess nudged her. You okay? Elena nodded stiffly. I'm fine. But that was a lie, because something told her that this flight had just become much more complicated. The turbulence passed, and the flight settled into its usual rhythm. Passengers resumed their quiet conversations, their mindless scrolling, their restless shifting in their seats. Elena tried to do the same, tried to convince herself that she could go back to the way things were before she knew who was sitting in 2A. But the awareness of Marcus Reynolds never left her. She could feel his presence like an unspoken weight, pressing against the edges of her focus, disrupting the balance she had so carefully maintained. And then, a chime. Elena turned to see the call light illuminated above 2A. Of course. Taking a steadying breath, she made her way down the aisle, smoothing out the tension in her posture before stopping at his seat. Mr. Reynolds, she said evenly, how can I assist you? He looked up at her, and this time, there was something new in his expression, an unreadable calculation. I was hoping we could talk, he said, his tone casual, but there was an edge to it. She hesitated. About. Marcus gestured toward the empty seat beside him. Sit. Her pulse spiked. There were very few reasons a senior executive would ask to talk mid-flight, and none of them boded well. She cast a quick glance around, making sure Jess was within sight before she slowly lowered herself into the seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice low. Tell me, Elena, how do you feel about this airline? The question took her by surprise. She blinked. What do you mean? His fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. I mean, how do you think it runs? How do you think employees are treated? Her stomach twisted. This was a test, a carefully laid trap disguised as a casual conversation. She knew how this worked. Say the wrong thing, and you were labeled difficult. Say too little, and you were seen as unobservant. So she chose her words carefully. I think every company has its strengths and its areas for improvement, she said smoothly. Marcus hummed, considering her response. Diplomatic. She didn't miss the way his gaze flickered over her, assessing, searching. Elena, he said after a beat, I'm not looking for a rehearsed answer. I'm looking for honesty. Honest. It was a dangerous thing in a corporate setting. She hesitated. Why ask me? Because I don't trust surface-level reports, he admitted. I trust the people who experience it firsthand. That gave her pause. He wasn't just here to observe. He was here to change something. But what? And more importantly, at what cost? She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable now. I think, she said carefully, that some people are seen, and some people aren't. His brows lifted slightly, as if intrigued by her answer. And you? He asked. Are you seen, Elena? She exhaled, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her skirt. I am now. Marcus held her gaze for a long moment before leaning back, nodding slightly. Good, he murmured. That's a start. Elena didn't know what he meant by that, but something told her that the turbulence on this flight wasn't over yet. Elena could still feel the weight of Marcus's gaze long after she returned to her duties. Even as she moved through the cabin, serving drinks and checking on passengers, her mind replayed every word of their conversation, analyzing every inflection in his voice, every shift in his expression. What did he mean by that's a start? What was he looking for? She had spent years perfecting the art of staying unnoticed, blending in, doing her job without attracting attention. And now, suddenly, she wasn't just seen, she was being studied, and not just by anyone, by the one man who could shape her future in an instant. She forced herself to focus as she reached row 17, where an elderly woman was struggling to open a snack packet. Elena smiled gently. Jess approached her near the galley, her expression tight. Okay, I can't stop thinking about it. Elena exhaled. Jess. I mean, how often do we get to say our new boss was sitting in first class while we did what? Jess hesitated, as if suddenly realizing she was treading into dangerous territory. While we followed protocol. Elena gave her a pointed look. Right. Jess sighed, leaning against the counter. Look, I know you don't want to talk about it, but come on. He's obviously paying attention to you. That's the problem. Jess tilted her head. You think he's looking for a reason to fire you? Elena didn't answer right away. That was the thing. She didn't know. Marcus hadn't seemed angry. If anything, he seemed intrigued. But that didn't mean he wasn't dangerous. Jess lowered her voice. Elena, what exactly happened back there? Elena hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening before relaying the conversation as vaguely as possible. When she finished, Jess let out a low whistle. Okay, so he's fishing for information. That's interesting. Interesting. That was one way to put it. Elena shook her head. I don't know what he wants, but I don't plan on finding out. Jess gave her a skeptical look. Elena, you don't get to decide that anymore. Like it or not, you're on his radar now. That was what worried her the most. The hours stretched on, the quiet hum of the aircraft filling the cabin as most passengers settled into sleep. Elena moved methodically through the aisles, checking seatbelts and clearing away stray cups. She should have been exhausted, but her nerves wouldn't let her rest. And then, another chime. 2A again. Elena took a steady breath, her fingers brushing against the hem of her uniform as she approached. Marcus was still awake, his eyes sharp even in the dimmed cabin lights. Mr. Reynolds, she said carefully, her voice quiet so as not to disturb the other passengers. He studied her for a moment before speaking. You look like you have something on your mind. She stiffened slightly. Just focused on my work. He tilted his head. Is that what you tell yourself when something is bothering you? Her jaw clenched. She didn't like that he could read her so easily. I'm here to assist you, she said, keeping her tone professional. He nodded slightly, as if he'd expected that response. All right then, tell me, Elena, what do you think I should know about this airline? The question caught her off guard. Again, I don't know what you mean. He exhaled, tapping a slow rhythm against the armrest. I think you do. She hesitated. If you're asking whether we do our jobs well, then yes. If you're asking whether passengers are treated with respect, yes. Marcus's expression didn't shift. He was waiting. She knew she could stop there. She could walk away. But something in his patience unnerved her. So she took a small, measured risk. There are other things, she admitted. Things that don't get reported. But I don't think you're looking for my opinion. Marcus raised a brow. And why is that? She met his gaze. Because executives don't ask for input unless they already have an agenda. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, Marcus smiled. It wasn't amusement. It was something sharper. Elena, he said quietly, you might be more interesting than I thought. A chill ran down her spine. Get some rest, he said, leaning back into his seat. You'll need it. Elena turned, walking away before she could ask what he meant. But she already knew. The storm had only just begun. Elena's hands tightened around the edges of the service cart as she wheeled it down the aisle, her mind still tangled in the conversation with Marcus. There was something about the way he looked at her, the way he spoke, as if he already knew the answers to the questions he asked. She hated it. More than that, she hated how it made her feel. Unstable. Exposed. For years, she had perfected the art of invisibility, a skill honed out of necessity rather than choice. She had learned to blend into the background, to do her job efficiently without drawing attention to herself. But Marcus Reynolds was forcing her into the spotlight, peeling away layers she had worked hard to keep intact. Jess caught up with her near the galley, her expression laced with curiosity. So, Elena exhaled sharply. So what? Jess nudged her lightly. What did he say this time? Elena hesitated. She should brush it off, keep it vague. But something about the weight of Marcus's words still clung to her skin. He asked what I think he should know about the airline, she admitted. Jess's brows shot up. And what did you say? That it doesn't matter what I think. Executives don't ask unless they already have an agenda. Jess whistled under her breath. Damn. And he smiled. Jess frowned. That's unsettling. Tell me about it. Elena pressed her lips together, stealing a glance toward first class. Marcus was still there, but now he was speaking to another flight attendant, a more senior one. His expression was neutral, but she could tell he was listening intently. He wasn't done gathering information, and that meant he wasn't done with her either. Later, during the crew's scheduled break, Elena sat in the staff section, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had no intention of drinking. The exhaustion had set in, but sleep wasn't an option, not with her thoughts unraveling in a dozen directions. She barely registered when another flight attendant, Olivia, sat down across from her. Olivia had been with the airline longer than most, and while she wasn't unkind, she carried herself with the cool detachment of someone who had seen all. You look like someone just handed you a live grenade, Olivia remarked, watching Elena closely. Elena huffed a quiet laugh. Feels about right. Olivia took a slow sip of her tea. Word is Reynolds is asking a lot of questions. Elena's eyes flickered up. You've noticed. Olivia smirked. Everyone has. Men like him don't sit quietly in first class for no reason. He's observing, testing the waters. She leaned in slightly. And from what I hear, he's particularly interested in you. Elena's stomach tightened. That's what I'm afraid of. Olivia studied her for a long moment before setting her cup down. Listen, I've been around long enough to know when a shakeup is coming. You want my advice? Elena hesitated, then nodded. Stay sharp. If he's looking for weaknesses, don't give him any to find. Easier said than done. As the flight neared its final stretch, Elena made a conscious effort to avoid Marcus as much as possible. She stuck to her assigned duties, kept interactions brief, and ignored the weight of his gaze whenever it landed on her. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. Just as she was collecting trash from the last round service, a deep voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin. Elena. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned. Marcus was standing near the galley, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. Walk with me, he said, nodding toward the empty section near the exit row. Elena hesitated, glancing around. The other attendants were busy, and passengers were settling in for the landing. Still, something inside her told her she had no real choice. She followed him, keeping her steps measured, controlled. When they were out of earshot, Marcus leaned against the bulkhead, studying her. You're avoiding me. Elena crossed her arms. You're making it difficult not to. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Fair. A tense silence stretched between them before he spoke again. You've been here a while, haven't you? 5 years. And in those 5 years, have you ever seen something you weren't supposed to? Elena's pulse spiked. There it was. The real question. The one he had been dancing around since the moment she first refused him a drink. She held his gaze, searching for a trap. What are you asking me? Marcus exhaled, shifting slightly. I know this airline isn't as pristine as it pretends to be. I also know that people like you. He paused. People who learn how to move unnoticed, see things others don't. Elena's fingers curled into her sleeves. And what makes you think I'd tell you even if I did? His expression didn't change. Because I think you're tired of pretending you don't care. The words hit deeper than she wanted them to. She hated that he was right. Elena had spent years swallowing the injustices that happened at 35,000 feet. The microaggressions, the double standards, the passengers who were treated like second-class citizens while others were given the benefit of the doubt no matter how they acted. She had learned to live with it. But now Marcus was standing in front of her, peeling back the layers, forcing her to acknowledge that she had seen too much, endured too much. And maybe, just maybe, He was offering her something she had long since given up on. Away, but at what cost? She swallowed hard. You're asking the wrong person, Mr. Reynolds. Marcus didn't look convinced. I don't think I am. Before she could respond, a voice crackled over the intercom. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. The moment shattered. Marcus pushed off the wall, straightening his jacket. We'll talk again soon. Elena watched him disappear back into first class, her heart pounding. She didn't know what game he was playing, but she had a feeling she was already losing. Elena had spent the last hour convincing herself that Marcus Reynolds was just another executive playing corporate chess, moving pieces without a second thought for the people underneath them. But something about the way he watched, the way he listened, it gnawed at her, an itch beneath her skin she couldn't shake. She told herself to ignore it, to pretend like nothing had changed. But everything had. It was after landing, when the passengers had disembarked and the crew was finishing their post-flight duties, that the first crack in her reality appeared. Jess was standing by the galley, scrolling through her phone, when her breath suddenly hitched. What the hell? She muttered. Elena barely glanced up. What now? Jess turned her phone around, her face pale. Tell me this isn't him. Elena frowned, taking the phone. The screen displayed an article, the headline bold, and impossible to ignore. Marcus Reynolds appointed as Director of Airline Operations, effective immediately. Her stomach dropped. No. She read it again, willing the words to change, but they remained the same. The article was from 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. That meant, he's not here to inspect first-class service, Elena murmured, the realization slamming into her like turbulence. Jess shook her head, equally stunned. No, he's here to assess the crew. A sharp breath left Elena's lungs. He was assessing me. A cold dread settled in her bones. This whole time, she had assumed Marcus was another high-level executive collecting data, someone she could ignore if she played it safe. But he wasn't just an observer. He was about to be their boss. And she had been avoiding him, challenging him. Hell, she had refused to serve him. Her pulse pounded in her ears. I need to go, she muttered, shoving Jess's phone back into her hands and pushing past her. Elena. But she didn't stop. She needed answers. She found Marcus near the boarding bridge, speaking to the captain. For a moment, she hesitated. She could walk away, pretend she hadn't seen the article, pretend none of this mattered. But she was done pretending. Squaring her shoulders, she stepped forward. Mr. Reynolds. Marcus turned, his expression unreadable. Elena. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Was this some kind of test? She demanded. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed his face. What do you mean? She scoffed, barely able to contain her frustration. Don't play games with me. You've been on this flight for hours, asking questions, watching. You let me believe you were just another passenger, just another executive passing through. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then exhaled. You weren't supposed to find out like this. That wasn't an answer. She took a step closer, lowering her voice. So what was it then? Were you evaluating me? Deciding if I should still have a job? Something in his jaw tightened. No? Then what? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost cautious. I wanted to see how this airline really operates, without the filter of corporate reports. I needed to know who I could trust. Elena's breath hitched. Trust. His gaze didn't waver. Not everyone wants change. Her thoughts raced. Was that what this was about? Did he think she wanted change? She swallowed hard. And did you find what you were looking for? Marcus hesitated, and for the first time, she saw something behind the cool control of his expression. Doubt. Regret. Not yet, he admitted. A bitter laugh escaped her. So what happens now? Marcus glanced past her, toward the terminal where airline executives were beginning to gather. Now, he said quietly, now everything changes. And somehow, Elena knew, this wasn't just about the airline. It was about her, too. Elena moved through the terminal in a daze, her footsteps quick but unsteady. The revelation about Marcus had unsettled something deep within her, like a floorboard suddenly giving way beneath her feet. He wasn't just a corporate observer. He wasn't just another passenger passing through her life. He was about to become the force that dictated her future in this airline, the very man who now had power over her career. And she had openly defied him. She could still see the way he had looked at her when he admitted, "Not yet. Not yet." What did that mean? That he hadn't decided if he could trust her? Or worse, that he already knew he couldn't. Her mind was spinning as she reached the crew lounge. Jess was already there, waiting, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "So?" Jess asked the moment Elena stepped inside. "What the hell did he say?" Elena didn't answer right away. She leaned against the counter, exhaling shakily. He admitted it. Jess's brows lifted. That he's the new boss. That he's been watching, Elena clarified. Evaluating. Jess cursed under her breath. "Damn, that's bad." Elena let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, it gets worse." She hesitated for a second before lowering her voice. He said not everyone wants change. Jess frowned. "Change? That's what he's looking for," Elena said. "People he can trust." But trust to do what? Why is he being so secretive? Jess bit her lip. Maybe he's shaking things up. Executives love doing that. You know, firing half the senior crew, replacing them with people who won't question authority. A sharp chill ran down Elena's spine. No, it was more than that. Marcus wasn't just looking to restructure. There was something beneath the surface, something he wasn't saying. Before Elena could voice that thought, the door to the lounge swung open, and Claire, one of the senior flight attendants, stepped in. She barely spared Elena a glance before walking straight to the back, where a few other crew members sat whispering among themselves. Elena wasn't sure if it was paranoia or intuition, but something about the way Claire moved felt off. And then she caught it. A glance. A quick, knowing glance between Claire and another senior attendant, followed by a barely there nod. Elena's stomach twisted. She'd seen that kind of silent communication before. It was the kind of glance exchanged between people who knew something others didn't. People who had already chosen sides. Not everyone wants change. The words rang louder in her head now. She suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. Jess must have noticed the shift in her expression because she leaned in whispering, "What's wrong?" Elena forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I think we're already in the middle of something, Jess, and we don't even know what it is." Jess straightened. "You think the senior crew knows something?" Elena didn't just think it. She was starting to believe it. But before she could say anything else, her phone buzzed. A message. "Meet me at gate 32. Now. Marcus." Elena's pulse quickened. She didn't hesitate. The gate was empty when she arrived, save for Marcus, who stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the runway. The storm brewing outside had darkened the sky, thick clouds rolling in as the wind howled through the gaps in the jet bridge. He didn't turn when she approached. "You came," he said simply. Elena crossed her arms. "You didn't leave me much of a choice." A hint of a smirk ghosted his lips before he finally turned to face her. "I need you to listen very carefully," he said, his voice lower than before, "because things are about to move fast." Elena's breath caught. "What things?" Marcus exhaled, glancing out the window again. "The people running this airline, the ones in charge before me, they're not just incompetent, they're corrupt." Elena's stomach dropped. "What?" she whispered. "They've been covering up safety violations," Marcus continued. "Cutting corners, falsifying reports, bribing inspectors. It's been going on for years." Elena could barely process the words. If this was true, if this was really happening, it wasn't just about company politics anymore. It was bigger than her, bigger than Marcus. "You're saying there are illegal practices happening?" Marcus nodded. "And I'm here to expose them." Elena took a shaky step back. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Marcus watched her carefully. "Because you're in the middle of it, whether you realize it or not. And I need to know. Can I trust you? The question hit harder than she expected. Could he And suddenly, she realized she was already standing on a fault line. The only question was which way the ground was about to break. The air in the flight crew lounge was heavy, thick with unspoken words and unacknowledged betrayals. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the walls, stretching and shifting like silent witnesses to the storm brewing within the room. Elena stood at the center of it all, her pulse pounding in her ears. Everything had led to this moment. The stolen glances between the senior crew, the hushed whispers behind closed doors, Marcus's cryptic warnings. It all made sense now. Across from her, Marcus remained calm, his expression unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his gaze, like a man who knew he was standing at the edge of a war. Claire stood beside him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of cold amusement. "You're lying," Claire said, her voice smooth and controlled. "No one is going to believe you." A slow, knowing smile spread across Marcus's face. "That's where you're wrong." Claire scoffed. "Really? And why is that?" "Because I have proof," Marcus said simply. Elena's breath caught. She had expected a battle of words, of accusations thrown back and forth, of denials and manipulations. But Marcus wasn't just here to confront Claire. He was here to end this. Claire's expression faltered for the briefest second before she schooled it back into indifference. "You're bluffing." Marcus pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. A second later, a video began playing. A grainy but clear security recording. Elena stepped forward, her stomach twisting as she watched the footage. It showed Claire and another senior crew member in a restricted area, speaking in hushed tones. The audio was muffled, but then, "No inspections. We handle this our way." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Claire remained still, her fingers curling slightly, but her mask didn't crack. "That means nothing," she said coolly, a few words taken out of context. Marcus tilted his head. "Is that so?" He tapped the screen again. The next recording played. This time, the conversation was clearer. "We've buried reports before. What makes you think we can't do it again?" Elena sucked in a sharp breath. There was no way to explain that away. Claire's jaw tightened. For the first time, she looked truly cornered. "You think this will be enough?" she murmured. Marcus stepped forward. "I think it's more than enough." For a moment, silence reigned. And then, Claire laughed. It was low, bitter, almost impressed. "Do you really believe this changes anything?" she asked, shaking her head. "You're naive, Marcus. You think you've won just because you have evidence." Elena's hands curled into fists. "People's lives are at stake," she said. "Passengers trust us. They trust that we're keeping them safe. And you," her voice shook with anger, "you put profits over lives." Claire met her gaze, something dark flickering in her eyes. "This is bigger than you, Elena," she said quietly. "Bigger than all of us." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Maybe, but it ends now." He pressed another button on his phone, and suddenly, Claire's own voice filled the room. "If he keeps pushing, we'll handle him the same way we handled the last one." A cold dread settled in Elena's stomach. The last one. Claire's mask finally cracked. Her eyes flashed with something dangerous, but was too late. The doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. "Claire Donovan," one of them said, "we need you to come with us." For the first time, true panic flashed across Claire's face. She turned to Marcus. "You." But Marcus didn't flinch. He just watched. Elena did too, her heart hammering as Claire was led away, her perfect composure finally shattered. As the door clicked shut behind them, the room fell into a heavy silence. Elena exhaled shakily. "Is it over?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, "Not yet." And deep down, Elena knew he was right. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The air outside the terminal was crisp, the kind that carried the weight of change. Elena stood near the glass window, watching as the world continued its steady rhythm beyond the chaos she had just emerged from. Claire was gone, arrested. The weight of her corruption, her lies, had finally caught up to her. But the victory didn't feel as sweet as Elena had imagined. Instead, it left a hollow ache, a lingering uncertainty that gnawed at her. Marcus stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. He hadn't said much after Claire had been taken away. There was a tension in his posture, something unresolved. She knew. Elena said finally, her voice quiet. She knew how deep it went, and she wasn't even afraid. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. She wasn't afraid because she never thought she'd lose. People like her, they build their fortresses so high, they forget they can still crumble. Elena turned to him. Do you think this is really over? Marcus's jaw tightened. No, but it's a start. A silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things they weren't saying. The truth was, Claire had been one piece of a much larger problem. There were others like her, people who saw power as a currency to be hoarded, people who believed they were untouchable. Elena had spent so much of her life believing that integrity and hard work were enough to survive in this world. But now, after everything, she wasn't sure anymore. She looked back at the tarmac, at the planes lined up, waiting for clearance to take off. A strange thought crossed her mind. How flight itself was an act of defiance, a push against gravity, against the natural order. Maybe justice was like that too. Maybe it wasn't about reaching a final destination, but about continuing to rise, despite the forces trying to pull you down. Are you staying? She asked, glancing at Marcus. He hesitated. I don't know yet. Elena studied him. He had been the catalyst for all of this, the one who had seen the cracks and refused to look away. But there was something unsettled in him, a restlessness that suggested he wasn't done fighting. You should, she said. People like you, we need more of them. He gave her a small, tired smile. People like us, you mean? Elena's chest tightened. For so long, she had felt like she was navigating this world alone. But maybe she wasn't. Maybe there were others. People who refused to let corruption win. People who believed in something greater than themselves. Maybe, despite everything, she still believed too. She turned back to the window, watching as the sun began to break through the clouds, casting long, golden streaks across the sky. A new day, a new fight, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.